portrait room. It was a cold and moonless night when I first saw the mansion. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the trees cast long, crooked shadows that reached across the road like skeletal fingers. I had just moved to the town, a tiny blip on the map, tucked away in the mountains. The locals were friendly enough, but they all seemed to avoid speaking about one thing: the mansion at the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for years, they said. It was owned by a reclusive family that had vanished one night without a trace. Some said they fled the country, others whispered of darker things, of disappearances, curses, and even ghosts. I dismissed it all as superstitious nonsense. But there was something about that mansion that drew me in. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore it. It stood there in the dark, its windows like empty eyes glaring out at me as I approached. I pried open the front door, which groaned like a dying man, and stepped inside. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, and the air was thick with decay. The house had a heavy silence, as if it were holding its breath. I wandered through the rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. The furniture was rotted, and the wallpaper peeled away in long, curling strips. It was clear that no one had set foot in this place for years. I began to think I was wasting my time, that there was nothing to be found here but dust and old memories. And then I found the portrait room. It was at the end of a long hallway, the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was filled with portraits, dozens of them, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. They were old, faded with age, but there was something unsettling about them. The eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the room, their gazes cold and unblinking. I walked along the walls, examining the portraits. They depicted a family, a man and a woman, their children, and what seemed to be generations of ancestors. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The faces in the portraits seemed wrong. The eyes were too dark, the smiles too wide, the skin too pale. It was as if the painter had captured something twisted and unnatural. I reached the end of the room, where the largest portrait hung above a grand fireplace. It was a massive painting, depicting the family seated together. But this one was different. The eyes of the figures seemed alive, and their expressions were filled with malice. The man in the center, presumably the patriarch, had a grin that stretched too far, revealing rows of sharp teeth. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to leave the room. But the door slammed shut, and the portraits seemed to come alive. The eyes blinked and shifted, the faces twisted and contorted. Whispers filled the air, low and menacing, as if the portraits themselves were speaking to me. I backed away, my heart racing, but the room seemed to close in on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold breath of something unseen on my neck. The portraits began to move, their figures reaching out toward me with long, bony fingers. I was trapped. I had ventured into the mansion seeking adventure, but I found something far worse: an ancient evil, bound within the walls of the portrait room. I knew I had to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears with their sinister promises. And then, from the largest portrait, the patriarch stepped forward, his twisted grin stretching even wider. I was paralyzed with fear as he reached out, his cold fingers closing around my arm. The last thing I remember was his voice, a low, rasping whisper that seemed to echo through my very soul: "Welcome to the family." After that, everything went black. No one ever saw me again. But the mansion still stands, and if you look closely at the portraits in the portrait room, you might just see a new addition: a young man, his eyes wide with terror, forever trapped in the cold embrace of the mansion's curse. Though I had vanished from the physical world, I was not entirely gone. I felt myself embedded in the fabric of the portrait, a sense of consciousness without any way to express it. I was merely a part of the madness, my essence reduced to a terrified face in a sea of tormented expressions. Time passed differently here. It stretched and shrank, a continuous loop of distorted realities. The patriarch, the one who dragged me into this nightmare, watched over the room with his unnaturally wide grin. He seemed to relish in our fear, feeding off it like a vulture on a carcass. Each day, or what felt like a day, he would step into the room, inspecting his captive collection. The other faces on the portraits were not entirely lifeless. They could whisper, and sometimes they did. In hushed voices, the family shared tales of horror, of those who entered the mansion and never left. They spoke of the curse, the unspeakable darkness that had consumed their family. It was said that the patriarch had made a pact with something ancient and malevolent. It granted him power and eternal life, but at a horrific cost. The whispers told me that they had once been living souls like me, drawn to the mansion by curiosity or greed, only to be trapped for all eternity. Their murmurs echoed through the canvas, recounting their regrets, their longing to escape. It was a chorus of despair, growing louder each time someone new was added to the collection. One day, while I was absorbed in the whispers, a young woman entered the room. She was part of a group of ghost hunters, equipped with cameras and other gadgets designed to capture paranormal activity. Her companions wandered the corridors, laughing and joking, but she seemed different, more cautious, more attuned to the darkness around her. As she entered the portrait room, I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this was my chance to escape, to warn her of the danger that awaited her. But as much as I tried, I could not move or speak. I was just another frozen face on the wall, unable to communicate with the living. The patriarch entered the room, his footsteps echoing ominously. The young woman turned toward the sound, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed something was wrong. She raised her camera and took a picture, but the flash seemed to provoke the spirits within the portraits. The other faces grew agitated, their whispers becoming more frantic. The patriarch lunged at her, his form flowing from the canvas like liquid shadow. The woman screamed, dropping her camera as she stumbled backward. The patriarch's grin grew wider, his eyes gleaming with hunger. He was no longer confined to the portrait, his malevolence had taken on a life of its own. But as he lunged, the whispers of the other souls grew louder, a cacophony of rage and defiance. It was as if they were pushing back, resisting the patriarch's control. The force of their collective will caused the room to shake, and the walls began to crack. The young woman seized the moment, grabbing her camera and running toward the door. As she fled, the patriarch's form wavered, the whispers of the trapped souls creating a vortex of energy that pulled him back toward the portraits. The walls trembled and the ground shook as the curse began to unravel. In one last desperate attempt, I tried to reach out, to escape the portrait that had imprisoned me for so long. The other souls lent their strength, their whispers building to a crescendo. The canvas tore, and I felt a surge of energy as the mansion itself began to collapse. The young woman escaped, her terrified screams echoing through the night. The mansion crumbled, the weight of its cursed history too much to bear. The portrait room was destroyed, the souls within finally finding release from their eternal torment. Though my physical form was gone, I felt a sense of peace, my spirit free from the patriarch's grasp. I drifted through the void, grateful to be free, my consciousness fading into the ether. The mansion was no more, but its legacy would live on in the stories told by those who narrowly escaped its grasp. The whispers of madness would no longer haunt the portrait room, but the memory of its darkness would linger in the shadows of the night. After the collapse of the mansion, whispers about the incident spread like wildfire through the small town. People exchanged hushed theories at the local diner, claiming it was an accident, an old building finally giving in to decay. Others spoke of curses and ghosts, their voices low and their eyes darting around, as if the darkness might still be watching. But no one knew the truth about the mansion's curse except for one woman. Marissa, the young woman who had narrowly escaped that night, had seen things she could never explain. She had fled the collapsing structure with only her camera and a rush of adrenaline. The memory of the patriarch's twisted grin burned into her mind. When the authorities arrived, they found the mansion reduced to rubble, the portrait room destroyed, and no trace of the souls that had once been imprisoned within. Marissa was taken to the hospital for shock, her camera placed in an evidence bag. The doctors insisted she stay overnight, but Marissa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the patriarch lunging at her, his shadowy form rippling with unnatural energy. She could hear the whispers, the echoes of the tormented souls that had helped her escape. And above all, she felt the lingering presence of the curse, as if the patriarch's malevolent spirit had not truly vanished. She retrieved her camera from the evidence bag. Though most of the photos were blurry from her frantic escape, there was one that stood out. It was the last picture she had taken, just before the patriarch lunged at her. The photo showed the portrait room, but with a strange distortion at its center. It was as if the image had been torn apart. The faces in the portraits contorted in agony. Marissa shuddered and set the camera aside. She knew she couldn't leave it at that. She had to find out more about the curse and what had happened to the patriarch. If his spirit still lingered, it might find a new way to wreak havoc. The only place to start was the town's archives, where records of the mansion's history might offer some clues. The next day, she made her way to the town's small library, a dusty building with creaking floors and a dimly lit basement. The librarian, a woman named Mrs. Lambert, was intrigued by Marissa's request for information about the mansion. She led Marissa to a corner of the basement where old records and newspaper clippings were stored in disorganized stacks. "These should help you," Mrs. Lambert said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But be careful. People say there's more to that mansion than meets the eye." Marissa spent hours poring over the records, uncovering a history of madness and death. The mansion had been built by a wealthy industrialist in the late 19th century, a man named Samuel Alder. He was known for his eccentric behavior and his interest in the occult. Local legends spoke of ritualistic gatherings, strange symbols carved into the walls, and a pact with a dark force that promised power and immortality. As Marissa read through the accounts of the mansion's dark past, she began to understand the depth of the curse. Samuel Alder had used the portraits to trap the souls of his victims, drawing power from their suffering. The patriarch she encountered was likely his spirit, sustained by the curse even after death. But what troubled Marissa the most was the realization that the curse might not have ended with the collapse of the mansion. The patriarch's spirit could still be out there, seeking a new place to anchor itself, a new way to spread its malevolence. The thought made her stomach turn. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave, she noticed something odd in the corner of the basement. A small portrait, partially obscured by old newspapers. She carefully moved the papers aside, revealing a face she recognized, the patriarch, his grin as sinister as ever. The frame was cracked, the canvas torn, but his eyes seemed to follow her as she backed away. Marissa knew then that the patriarch's curse was far from over. The mansion might be gone, but his spirit had found a new vessel. She had to warn others, to find a way to end the curse before it claimed more souls. But as she stared into the patriarch's eyes, she realized that he might already be watching, waiting for his next victim. And the whispers, the echoes of madness, were only just beginning.